Well, this is definitely the most information we have received in the past 24 hours as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, along with the Secretary of Defense, held this live briefing at the Pentagon where we received a slew of answers to questions that remain out there as we've been following this story after this missile strike hitting Polish territory. Was it Ukraine? Was it Russia? The finger pointing continues, but now we have a little bit more clarification here. Once again, I want to bring in Tom Soufi Burridge, who's joining us live from Poland, and also Mick Mulroy, our national security and defense analyst. So, Tom, let me start with you because it's interesting, this back and forth. Russia denying that it was their missile that hit Poland. Ukraine, now we understand, Zelensky coming forward denying it was a Ukrainian missile. However, as we heard there from the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, right now they are sticking with what Polish President Duda is saying, and that is most likely it was a Ukrainian missile. President Duda calling it a misfortunate mistake. What else stood out to you, Tom, about this briefing as you've been following this since the very beginning?
Yeah, it was fascinating to listen to these two key players on the conflict in Ukraine right now. I mean, look, on the missile strike, just quickly, look, there's clearly divergence between the Ukrainian position and the US position on that. That's rare in this conflict. And I think with the two figures in this briefing, Secretary Austin and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff weren't really drawn on that. Look, the bigger picture here that I think is fascinating is basically Mark Milley, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff's comments a few days ago about winter potentially being a kind of opportunity for talks between Russia and Ukraine and the possibility of a peace deal. Now, he was drawn on that. Our correspondent, our reporter, Louis Martinez, was in the room as well, putting questions. And look, he was interesting on this because he basically set out the military reality on the ground. Yes, Ukraine has made massive progress up in the northeast, just recently in the south with the city of Kherson. But he was basically setting out the card-hold reality going into winter that other Western officials have put in briefings that I've attended to in recent days, that really the notion that it's going to be very hard for Russia or Ukraine to make massive gains in the weeks or months to come, potentially. And that, therefore, in Mark Milley's view, leaves at least the door open to negotiations. Now, I think on one hand, he's putting out this kind of idea, I think, to Ukraine to make sure that Ukraine takes the moral upper hand in all this and says, look, we are open to dialogue, but we've got clear red lines, our territorial integrity being the main one. But I think also, to some extent, this is also maybe a message going out to the elite in Russia, to, high-minded business people, to people who are, in positions of relative power, but might be beginning to think, OK, Russia's losing this war. Is it really in Russia's best interest to keep going at this war and to potentially keep losing big? And as Mark Milley said, negotiations are a good time for Ukraine right now because their enemy is in a weak position.
Right, and just to follow up on that, Tom and Mick, I'll get to you in a second. Secretary Austin talking about winter gear, that they will continue to support Ukraine as winter hits, that Canada has been a big ally here, supporting the Ukrainians, supplying them for the winter, whereas it could be a pivotal time for Russia as their supply chains are being blocked, as more support is coming into Ukraine, gearing up for the cold temperatures and fighting through the winter. So that'll be interesting as the battlefield will change. Will that impact how the war goes as well? Mick, let me ask you a question because I thought General Milley brought up some good points when there was this back and forth as to, all right, where did the missile come from? Was it Russian? Was it Ukraine? What's the deal? Secretary Austin making it clear, though, that right now they're sticking with most likely a Ukrainian missile because that's what the Polish President Duda believes at this point as they are continuing the investigation. However, it was interesting that Milley brought up they are going to look at debris fields. They're going to look at the data. They're going to be able to find out the point of origin from where that missile was and also the flight path of that missile. So give us a reality check here, Mick. How soon could we actually learn of the real life data that will tell us indeed whose missile it was and where exactly it was coming from and where it was pointed?
So, Kara, I think there's probably already been a preliminary review of that information, which is why there is a belief that this was likely from a Ukrainian air defense system. Of course, they wouldn't have had to shoot those missiles if they weren't being attacked by Russia, and certainly targets on the border could cause this, not only this, but also in the future, as it's unknown where a missile would go after it intercepts one. So that's the first important thing to point out. They will be looking at the radar, which is captured, which will give you the point of origin. It'll give you the trajectory and where it was actually intercepted. And then if it was a missile coming from the Ukraine air defense, also where that came from and how this could have happened. And I think it's important to note that it certainly was a tragedy for the people that were killed and their families. But if it was not an intentional act by Russia, we may have avoided an escalation that nobody would want.
Right, agreed. So then, Tom, let me ask you this then, because you've been on the ground there. You know President Zelensky pretty well and the people. Actually, do we still? Okay, we're kind of losing your shot, but I can still see you, Tom, now. You came back. Given what Mick said, that they probably have a pretty good idea here in the U.S. what the data is showing and where that missile came from. And Secretary Austin was pretty confident when he said that most likely it was a Ukrainian missile. Why would Zelensky come forward and say, no, it's not a Ukrainian missile? Because to this point, he's been pretty transparent and honest about things, right?
Yeah, look, I think this is a good question, Keir. It's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, look, there is a brutal propaganda war going on. This is a war, and that there's always propaganda in every single war, right? So the Russians, their propaganda is more. Well, I mean, they lie much more often, right? I mean, I think in propaganda terms, Ukraine takes a morally higher position than the Russians. We see it every day. You know, we can't trust any Russian figures on the number of soldiers or equipment they've killed at all, whereas sometimes the Ukrainians, I think, they probably pump the numbers up a bit. That's my kind of professional opinion. But on this, this propaganda, I can't really say why Zelensky, whether him and his military, and we heard Milley and Austin pressed on that point, and Milley wouldn't actually go into his conversations with his counterpart Zaluzhny, which is the commander of the Ukrainian armed forces. I mean, whether or not Ukraine has some other data they think that gives them confidence to say this, or whether or not they are trying to play a propaganda game and trying to get the message out and see how that sort of plays on social media or not, that's the only theory I can put forward right now. But really, I'm largely speaking, like you, I'm in the dark.
Mick, what do you think?
Well, Kara, I think Tom's right. I mean, there is a propaganda aspect to this. They are competing with the narrative coming out of Russia, which is almost always incorrect or at least partially untrue. But that, I think, would change if the United States did have definitive data that could show President Zelensky that this was, in fact, a Ukrainian missile. Obviously, completely unintentional, and again, would not have had to happen if they weren't under almost a near continuous attack by the Russians, especially since the pullout of Kherson. So ultimately, as the president of Poland said, this is the responsibility of Russia. But I do think President Zelensky could be convinced if the Americans show the evidence that they are likely gathering right now to make that determination.
And Tom, since Mick mentioned Kherson and also Kharkiv, General Milley did really lift up the Ukrainians and the forces for being able to basically give the boot to the Russians when it came to those two key areas. But he also made it very clear about how he felt about a full Ukrainian victory, kicking all of Russia out. He was pretty direct when he said, yes, they may be making progress, and yes, Russia is losing a lot of men, a lot of tanks, a lot of resources, but still, with regard to all of Russia getting kicked out of Ukraine, he said, not happening soon.
Yeah, look, I mean, this is the reality on the ground. And so there's a divergence between the political rhetoric, and remember, Zelensky has to play to his domestic Ukrainian audience on this, and the card-hold reality. And the card-hold reality is that Ukraine has made massive territorial gains. Now, is Ukraine going to stop there? No, I don't think so. I think they still see that they can push forward in certain parts of the front line. I think they probably think they can take more territory in the eastern Donbass. They want at least to try and regain the land that Russia has claimed since February. But remember, Russia, via proxies, claimed a big part of the eastern Donbass back in 2014 and annexed Crimea. The eastern bit of the Donbass they've held since 2014 via their proxies will be much harder to take back than other parts they've taken since February, because the population there has consumed and digested and to some extent been brainwashed by Russian propaganda for a very long time. And a lot of Ukrainians in that territory back in 2014 fled. I've got friends who got out of that territory. Crimea is another ball game altogether, if you like. Russia has a massive military presence on the peninsula. It will be incredibly hard for the Ukrainians to take that back.
Right. And we heard our Louis Martinez there, our producer there at the Pentagon, asking specifically about Crimea. Well, a lot of information to digest. Definitely moves the story forward. Tom Soufi Burridge and Mick Mulroy, appreciate you both so much. We will keep talking throughout the afternoon.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.